Welcome back, everyone. So, yes, let me quickly introduce you all to our next speaker, who is also one of our organizers, Bharat Malia. Hi, Bharat.
Hi Shabir,
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, Bharat. So, we have only seen you as an organizer till now, but now
Yeah,
we are fortunate enough to even hear from you on one of the most challenging topic that we face during our implementation of securely integrating Dynamics 365 FNO with bank. And just to provide the audience with a small introduction, so Bharat is a community leader and passionate about cloud computing and event driven architecture and has been working in dynamic space since the Dynamics AX days. And Bharat will now walk us through bank integration patterns for Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. So over to you, Bharat, and best of luck.
thank you Shabir. Okay, so let me quickly share my screen. Let me know once you are able to see my screen.
Yes, Bharat, we are.
Thanks Shabir. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening all. It's my pleasure to presenting my learnings here in the community. So today's topic is the bank or third-party integration that predominantly on how to ensure that encryption or decryption mechanism works in any sort of bank or any third-party integration where we need to exchange the information securely. So this is little about me. So myself Bharat Kumar Malviya and I'm a technical solution architect having more than 12 years of experience in Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation and earlier version of Dynamics CX as well. I'm currently working with data consultancy services uh, as a technical solution architect, and currently located in Sydney, Australia. So I've been part of very much of the implementation that involves designs and implemented complex solutions as well, and mostly in the utilities and the logistics industries. So I'm enthusiastic for learning and designing complex solutions. Apart from Dynamics 365, I also have very much experience in the Power Platform and various Azure services. So this is little about me, and if you would like to contact me, these are my email address and LinkedIn handler. So you can always contact me. I'll be available, and I'll be available for any kind of help as well. So as we go, since Shabir has mentioned that what I'm going to present, so this is the agenda that I'm going to present now. So as you might be aware that there are many use cases that we have learned in the various implementation, and that requires encryption and decryption before transmitting the data or after receiving the data. So how those works and what are the use cases that requires encryption and decryption? What are the need arise? So that we will discuss here. First, I will start with some concept of what is encryption, decryption, various component and various components involved in this process, and what are the options available for implementing the solution that involves encryption and decryption. So, as those are most of the technical aspects, but I will also try to touch base so that you can leverage these learnings in your implementation or designing the solutions as well. There are a couple of approaches, and what would be the best approach that I will suggest here. So I will stick to the considering that Azure as a cloud world and what we are. So the cost effective solution, what will be the cost effective solution? I will also touch base for different approaches. At the end of the session, I will touch base on the hands-on on the recommended approach, which I will showcase later. Uh, Moving to the next slide. So what are the common use cases? So we are going to talk about the file integration and mainly involves encryption and decryption of file. Yeah. So as in the typical scenarios that we have used file integrations where we need to encrypt or decrypt the data while processing the files and sending it to or receiving from the third party or bank. It could be bank or third party. As we are very well aware that in the financial apps, we have a common we have to communicate with the banks for various purposes such as sending the payments, sending the payment or collection request, or receiving the acknowledgements from the bank. We might also require to receive the electronic statement from the bank for processing the bank reconciliation and other sort of communication that involves some dispute with the bank. So those exchange can be happen through files, and in some cases, banks are enforcing that all the information should be in the encrypted way while transmitting. Either it is from bank to customer or it is from customer to bank. So since we are dealing with the transmitting of financial information, there could be high chance that uh, there could be high chance that it could be altered or uh, modified by someone. So to prevent that, the bank or any customer recommends that all the information should happening exchange happening through various channels, and it should be secure. The other use cases that we have that sometimes we need to interact with the subcontractors or other vendors or business partners as well. So let me give one example that I worked with one of the implementation in the past, and that uh, customer is dealing with the third party logistics suppliers. So all the logistics are maintained by the third party. Whenever any purchase orders are issued, then or sales orders are issued, those customer has to send the information to the third party logistics for processing those logistic information. So in that case, since that was a file based exchange and those files has to be encrypted while transmitting, so there also this particular solution can be implemented. So these are the common use cases that we have. I will quickly touch base on various concepts that we have. So first, I will go through with what is the encryption and decryption. So we'll quickly look how encryption and decryption work, and we'll touch base on various concepts. So first, what is the encryption? The encryption is a process of transforming the data to other format, which cannot be altered or read by machine or human. So to encrypt the data, it involves various complex algorithm and logic, and also requires various patterns to encrypt the data. And typically, those patterns are called keys. When we talk about keys, so there could be two type of keys. One is symmetric key. The symmetric key is a single key that is used for both encryption as well as decryption. The same key will be used in both the cases. So, what is the need of symmetric key and where it can be used? So, the symmetric key can be used in situations where you need to archive the data or archive the historic data, we can say. So, to archive the historic data, if customer is insisting that we should have data stored on in the archival in encrypted format. So symmetric key can be used where the data will be encrypted and archived. And while retrieving the data from the archival storage, the same key can be used to decrypt and process the data. So where it involves only single party. Uh, it is not recommended to exchange the data with the multiple parties in the symmetric case. The next one is asymmetric key. So what is asymmetric key? It is a pattern that is used to encrypt and decrypt, where encryption and decryption is performed by separate keys. These keys are also called as private key and public key pair, or key and anti-key pair. The encryption is done by one of the key and decryption is done by anti-key. Usually, the key for the encryption is uh, shared with other parties, and the key for decryption remains with the original party or the main party who can process the information or decrypt the information. What is the decryption? Decryption is reversal of encryption, where once the data is encrypted and transmitted, the other party has to revert the data into original form so that they can process. So decryption is a process of reverting the data into original form, and usually the decryption will be done through the anti keys, which can also be called as private key. I would like to give some more insights on the basic concept that we are talking about on encryption and decryption. So, uh, as in the previous section, I mentioned about keys or public key and private key. So, little bit more on the public key, private key, and related information. So, being a technical or solution architect, it is very critical to know these concepts. Otherwise, we end up with more learning, research, and it might be requiring extra efforts. So, let me first start with the public key. So, the public key is used to encrypt the information before sharing to the another party. Usually, the public key can be shared with one or more parties. For example, the bank has its own public key that is shared with the customer, so that customer can encrypt the data before sending it to bank. Similarly, when the bank is sharing the data to the customer, bank can bank can sorry customer can share the public key to bank, so that bank will encrypt the data and share with the customer. So it works in the either way. The public key is also being used to sign and verify the data. So let's consider one scenario where the information or file is encrypted and shared to the main party. The main party is not sure whether the data is correct, or the receiving part, the sender party is trustworthy. So the customer can use public key to verify the data from the data signature and later process it. Coming to the private key, so the private key is, remain with the main party, and it will be used to decrypt the encrypted data. The private key is secured by sometimes the private key is secured by the passphrase, or you can say the password, which will provide additional security to the uh, decryption process. The private key cannot be used for encryption of data, so it will only be used for decrypting the encrypted data. If you would like to encrypt the data, then it will not work. Next is ASCII armor. So when encrypting the data, there might be possibility that the character set of the information is converted into some binary characters, which may not be transmitted through various channels, such as email or any other exchange. So we need encrypted data to be converted into ASCII format or the ASCII character set. So the ASCII armor is the process of converting the data, encrypted data, to the ASCII character set so that it can be transmitted through various channels or email. Last, as I mentioned earlier, that while transmitting the information to the party, receiving party has to validate the source and the correctness of incoming data. Thus, the sender will request the request to sign the data with a public key, and receiving party can verify it. So consider one scenario where bank is enforcing secure transmission with the customer. As as part of initial setup, uh, both party, that is customer as well as bank, will share their public key with each other. So bank will share its own public key to customer will share the public key to bank. So whenever customer is sharing the data to bank, it will encrypt the data with the bank's public key, and uh, it will sign the data by their own or customer's own public key. When the bank receives the file or data, they can first validate with the customer's public key that whether the data is correct or authenticated, or the source of incoming data is authenticated or trustworthy. Then only it will decrypt the data. In the other way around also, when the bank is sharing the file or data to the customer, in that case, bank will encrypt the data and sign it with the customer's public key. And when customer is receiving the data, then it will validate or verify the data with the public key, its own public key. And once it is verified, then only it will be decrypted and processed. So sign and verify is the process of uh, validating the correctness of data and the trustworthy sources. So, so since we are talking about encryption and decryption, and you must be aware that various frameworks has to be there for encryption and decryption. There must be a common framework that will be used by industry. So in the industry, there is a most common framework which is called pretty good privacy, or we can say PGP in the short. It uses various algorithms, and those algorithms are industry accepted and have various complex. These are very difficult to crack or reverse engineering the data, since it uses the long keys, which we can say the public keys or private keys. The public key or private key can range from 32-bit to 4096 bit. So the longer the public key, the more strong the encrypted data will be, and it will be very difficult to decrypt without relevant private key. It uses various algorithms, and those algorithms are industry accepted. Uh, Next, coming back to the approaches, which is the key part of this discussion. So, since we are talking about encryption and decryption in D365 Finance and Operations app or any other D365 app, we need to understand the approaches to implement it and leverage the correct approach for implementation. There are various approaches available, and I'm going to talk about few approaches which I have considered or explored in the past, and I will also suggest which will be the recommended approach that should be implemented in the solution. As we know that we need to work on the file, and the file, when the file is generated by D365 app, so some process need to encrypt the file before sharing it to the another party. So the first approach that I am going to consider is Dynamics 365 customization. We can do any customization in D365 Finance and Operation app or any other D365 app through extension or customization framework or model. Since the customization will be part of Dynamics 365 code base, so it will not require any separate deployment. So all the deployment of solution will be part of deployment of other artifacts of D365. However, there are disadvantages of having these approaches. Since we are doing the customization, it will be tightly coupled with D365. So it does not give control to IT support in case of any failure or in case any troubleshooting is required, because it is part of your Dynamics 365 component itself. So another point, it may not provide proper telemetry data in case of failure, and that approach will be less maintainable. If you want to modify anything, consider one scenario that the third party or bank has asked to change the approach of encryption or decryption. In that case, you will end up with more customization in Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation. And during that time, you might require to uh, shut down that particular process or uh, entire application for the maintenance purpose. Another scenario that I personally faced, where bank is asking that all the incoming source should be from the specific IP address. It is a very common requirement that third party are asking for data transmission from specific IP address or range of IP address. And since D365 application is hosted on the cloud data centers and having cloud capabilities such as elasticity, disaster recovery, and others as well. So the IP address of the data center or the process might be differ based on the time. Thus, it is not advisable to have specific or static IP for your Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation or any other app. So in that case, this particular approach cannot be used. The another part is it will be tightly coupled with Dynamics 365. And while we are implementing any solution, it is advisable that the solution should be decoupled the components, various components that it is using. The more decoupling in the components, it will have more robust framework. So that's the reason instead of having Dynamics 365 customization, we will have another approach that I'm going to talk, and it is Windows Service. So what is Windows Service? As we all know that we use Windows operating system on the daily basis, and we know that various services are executing uh, in the background. We can also build our own service to implement the encryption and decryption solution. Those services will be interacting with some storage. It could be a blob storage or file share. And once the encryption is done, the data will be uploaded back to the storage location, relevant storage location, so that that can be shared with the another party. The advantage of having the approach is that it will have a dedicated resources. uh, when we are talking about dedicated resources, that means it will have a dedicated CPU, memory, and priority. We can define the priority of the execution of the particular solution or the service. It also gives more control to the file system, since the service is directly hosted on the Windows operating system, and Windows operating system is directly interacting with the its own file system. So it gives more control on the file system. But nowadays, since we are in the cloud world, we need to interact with the storage which is available on the cloud, such as Azure storage or any other. So Windows Server has a capability to use the file share from the Azure storage as a service. However, in the Windows service, there are a couple of disadvantages as well. So the first disadvantage is the solution will not be platform independent. In nowadays, most of the customer are asking for the solution that is reusable and the platform independent. So in that case, this solution may not be feasible. So the another disadvantage is that we are end up with underutilization of the resources. Considering the dedicated VM to host the service and only small CPU and memory is required to process the encryption and decryption. But the server will have high configuration. It will have a more CPU, it will have more memory, and this will not suffice the purpose of the resources that will be utilized. So another disadvantage is high operational cost. Since we need to deploy the service on the specific virtual machine or physical machine, that will require infrastructure setup. If we are using the virtual machine, it could be your virtual machine hosted on the cloud. Then we are end up with the infrastructure as a service on the cloud concept. But still, we will be responsible for maintenance of the those virtual machines. Thus, it will require or it will have additional operational cost. It comes with various maintenance activities such as hardware maintenance or software maintenance, or if we need to upgrade the operating system or other component of the virtual machine. Another aspect, it will require dedicated workforce to manage it, so who can monitor. And last but not the least, that it will not provide any centralized telemetry of any failures that happening in the solution. So in the cloud world, nowadays all the telemetry is centralized. So the solution should be to have a more centralized and more platform independent. With that, we have another approach which I would like to uh, add here, which is Azure Functions. Azure Functions are lightweighted and work on the serverless computing concept. These are executing without any server because at the runtime, the resources will be allocated when the functions will be triggered. As soon as the function executions are completed, the resources will be deallocated. Thus, it is work based on the serverless computing. It does not require any dedicated server, so it is easy to maintain those functions. It can also remove the possibility of having a customization in Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation or setting up additional infrastructure which requires in the Windows services. Another advantage of having the Azure function is that since the world is moving over the cloud, and any solution that we are implementing should be seamlessly integrated or seamlessly working seamlessly working with other cloud services or resources. When we are talking about other cloud resources or services, it can be your Logic App, APIM, or any other services that we want to use. So it will, since it will not require any infrastructure, so it will not incur any infrastructure cost, and we don't need any dedicated infrastructure to deploy the functions, Azure functions, since the resources will be allocated at the runtime and deallocated as soon as the purpose is solved. Thus, the operational cost of Azure function will be very less compared to uh, customization in Dynamics 365 and Windows services. Another advantage of having Azure function is centralized telemetry because the Azure function can be seamlessly integrated with Azure Insight for the monitoring purpose, and we can get the telemetry data from the Azure Insight. I'll not go much on the disadvantages of the Azure function, but I would like to add only a couple of points that Azure function does not support multitasking. If your process requires or if your solution requires multitasking, then the Azure function might not be suitable for the purpose. The another disadvantage is that the Azure function should not have complex business logic. It should be simple because Azure functions, as we know that a function is a unit of work that we need to perform. So similar in the same concept, Azure functions also work. That it should have a minimum logic and not the complex one. The next approach that I have is container instance. So let's consider one scenario that a bank or any third party has provided an application that is responsible for encryption or decryption of the data. When you need to when you need to send the data, you will first need to encrypt the data through the application. When you are receiving the data from the third party or bank, you need to decrypt it, and that will be done only through specific app that is provided by third party or bank. In that case, you need to host or deploy the software or application to some sort of infrastructure. To do that, there is another approach, and it is a very good concept that Azure or any other cloud platform has. It's called containerizing the application or service. You can containerize the service and create a container instance and deploy that container instance to the cloud. And this can be accessible through fully qualified domain name, which is specifically called as a specific URL to access the resource. So we can access those container instance through the URI or a fully qualified domain name as well. This is good option if we require any dedicated computing, but it will have a low operational it will have a low operational cost compared to Windows Server. It also uses persistent storage since the container instance does not have its own storage. It will be only available as part of a compute. Thus, the Azure storage file share. Uh, File share is a type of service in the Azure storage that can be leveraged as a medium of uh, storing the data or by container instance, and it can be easily integrated with the container instance. The container instance are also platform independent. The cons of the container instance or the disadvantages of the container instance are that uh, it will require a bit more high operational cost compared to the Azure function because it requires specific technical skills to create or build and deploy the instances. And it also requires dedicated CPU and memory while deploying the container instance. Consider one scenario that you have deployed one Windows service and the Windows virtual machine is having 16 gigs of memory and CPU. Let's say uh, some sort of CPU, but that 16 gigs of memory is not required entirely for the solution. So in the container instance, you can specify that how much memory will be required by the particular solution or the container instance. you can allocate only that particular memory. Nevertheless, that since the container instances are hosted on the cloud, elasticity will be there. In case of any need is arise, then the cloud infrastructure will automatically allocate more resources or more compute, more memory to the container instance. And once the purpose is finished, that can be released. So it also follows the pattern of elasticity. So based on these four approaches, I would like to conclude that which approach is best suitable for implementing the solution for encryption and decryption. So in my personal recommendation, the Azure function is the most uh, suitable option for implementing the solution. I will also showcase that how this particular approach is working here. So uh, in the left side, you can see your finance and operation app, and that is responsible for generating the data file. The data file will be stored in specific storage location. Here, for this demonstration purpose, I have considered that the data files will be stored in the Azure storage location or Azure storage block. So as soon as the files are generated by Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation or any other app as well with under the family of Dynamics 365, the files will be exported and stored into Azure storage. In the real world scenario, it could be Azure storage or it could be SharePoint or any other as well. In this example, I have considered Logic App and Azure Functions. So once the file is exported, the Logic App will be triggered that retrieves the file from the Azure storage and call the Azure function to encrypt the file. Once the file content is encrypted, then the file will be further pushed to the bank. Here, in this particular demonstration, I considered the bank as another party. So the files will be uploaded to the bank's SFTP, considering the bank is using SFTP. It might require some REST APIs that also supports by Logic App. So we can call the Logic App to call the Azure function or trigger the Azure function to encrypt the data and further push it to relevant parties file share. On the other way around, when we need to receive the information or data from the other party or let's say bank, we are receiving the electronic statement or e-statement from the bank. The bank will encrypt the data and put it in the SFTP. The logic app will be triggered who will listen to the SFTP, and once the file is there, it will retrieve the file, call the Azure function so that Azure function can decrypt, verify and decrypt the data. Once the data is decrypted, it will be further pushed to the Dynamics 365 through either uh, directly calling the APIs or putting it into the storage locations where from where the Dynamics 365 app will be retrieving the data. So this is the typical example that commonly used around the implementations for encryption and decryption. Uh, with that, I would like to give some more insights on hands-on experience. So in the hands-on experience, I have used Azure Function. Okay. So I have already created one Azure function and I have deployed it over the Azure. And I will demonstrate that how that Azure function is also created. So I will not go much into much detail that what is the security pattern that we have used for creating the Azure functions and how it will be triggered. For this particular demonstration, I have used Azure function which is called encrypt. it will be responsible for encrypting the data, and the trigger will be HTTP trigger. You can use any sort of trigger with Azure Function, because Azure Function has a rich capabilities. You can put the or you can execute the functions in the recurrence mode. You can execute the functions through the HTTP call or the blob storage, event grid, or any other sort of triggers you can leverage. So for this particular example, I used HTTP trigger. Purposefully, I have used HTTP trigger because if we need to call the Azure function from the logic app, then it has to be in the HTTP format. There will be HTTP URI that will be generated while deploying the functions to the Azure, and that URI will be used in the logic app to trigger the functions. The security or the authorization level I have set as anonymous for this particular demonstration. There are multiple authorization levels are available, such as admin. Only the administrator of the resource can execute or trigger the functions. Anonymous, anybody can trigger the function. We can use function as an authorization level, where you need to provide the function key. If you provide the function key, then only the system will recognize that, yeah, whether the function key is valid, then it will trigger the or execute the business logic. We can define system and user as well. Only specific user can trigger the business logic. So for this particular demonstration, I've used anonymous. The verbs I have used is get and post. Okay. So when I'm receiving the any HTTP request, first I need to deserialize the HTTP content or the body content, request content. When we are calling from logic app, the body of the request has to be in the JSON format. So that is the purpose, that the specific data or the request body is converted or deserialized into the JSON data, and from the JSON data, I'm retrieving specific JSON attribute or JSON content. I'm creating the stream for that content, and since we are using that stream for encrypting the data. Now, for encrypting the data, we will also need a public key, because as I mentioned in the earlier section, that all the encryption will be done only through the public key, and decryption will be done only through the private key. To encrypt the data, I need to get a key information. I can uh, so I have stored all the key information in the environment variable, so I can get the key information here, and I'm getting that key information in the base 64 format and convert it into the stream. Sorry. So once I get the public key as a stream, I have used one library which is available on NuGet library manager. It's called PGP core. In the PGP core, there are variety of functions that can be leveraged for performing various purpose. So since I'm using the streams for managing the data, and I need to encrypt the data, so I'm calling the encrypt stream async function. So as part of this function, what I need is I need an input stream or the input data which I need to encrypt, the encrypted data which will become as an output stream, and the public key, the last two information, which will be whether it needs to be ASCII armor, which I mentioned earlier. The encrypted data will be converted into the ASCII format. So yes, we are going to convert it into the ASCII format. So ASCII armor is yes, and with integrity check. So it will also check the integrity of the data. whether the data is correct and cross-validate after encryption. Once the output stream is available after encryption, we will return the output stream from the function. So whoever is triggering the function, it will retrieve the response from the function and process it. So the response will be your encrypted data. I'll quickly showcase. This is the function which I have deployed, and uh, under the configuration, you can define your public key, private key information as part of environment variable or application setting. So here you can see that the private key and the public key values are there, and the private key is also secured with the passphrase. Uh, these are the functions that we have deployed, and when I talk about a function, it will have a specific URI. Since I have used authorization level as a, anonymous, I will get only specific URI without any function key. If the authorization level is function, then we can define the aspect as well. So this is the Azure function. I'll quickly show what logic app I have created. So this is the logic app that I have created. What it does, that it will retrieve the data from, or retrieve the blob storage from the uh, storage location, get the data, sorry, it will retrieve the data, and for each data it will try to call the HTTP here. So here you can see when I'm calling the HTTP action, I'm specifying the function's URI. So that URI will be invoked since we have used HTTP trigger. And as you can see in the body section, I have passed the content of the blob or file in the JSON format. So the key is content and the value will be your actual file content. So as soon as your function is called, it will convert the content into encrypted form. As part of response, I'm saving the body which is received from the function to another storage. So let me give some more input on the storage locations that how I have configured, and I will run one process. So when any file or any file will be coming from Dynamics 365, it will come into the in folder of the particular container. When the logic app will be triggered, then it will encrypt the inbound file, encrypt it, and put it into the out folder. This way, it is just a simple logic app, but in the actual business scenario, you might need to push the file into your third party SFTP or bank SFTP, or calling another REST APIs to pass the information to the parties. I'm going to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation. Here I have considered one scenario where vendor payments will be done and the payment file will be generated. Once the payment file is generated, the payment file will be placed into the in folder of the storage location which I have mentioned here. And once the logic app will be triggering, it will encrypt the data. So I'm going to the payment journal.
Hi,
I
Bharat.
already,
Sorry to stop in between. Bharat, just a quick time check.
yeah,
Our
it
next
won't take
our
much
next
time.
speaker is lineup.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this is the uh, payment journal which I have already created. I'll just change the status of payment line to none. I will generate the payment. As soon as I generate the payment, I have used electronic reporting for generating the payment. So I'm generating the payment with relevant parameters. It won't take much time. Yeah, the file is generated. I'll go into the storage location, and we can see that the file is available. So let's say we have used the Bank of America. So Bank of America daily output file which we are generating. Now we will trigger the logic app. It should encrypt the file and place it into the out folder. So as of now, in the out folder there is nothing. I'm triggering the logic app. And as I mentioned that the logic app can be seamlessly integrated with the function, and the functions are lightweighted. The execution will be much quicker. So we can see that the logic app execution is completed. Now I'm going to the storage location out folder and just refresh it. So here we can see that the file is created. I'll download it and just show it to you that how the content will be visible. I might need to open in the notepad. Here you can see that the content is in the encrypted format, and only the private key can decrypt the content. So this is all I have as part of this particular session. So to conclude it, I would suggest that for encryption and decryption, if you want to implement any solution, please leverage Azure Functions as a implementation approach. Uh, if you have any question or anybody has any questions, I'm open for that.
So Bharat will give 2 or 3 minutes if someone has any questions.
Yeah.
Folks, if you have any question, you can raise your hand. Okay, I think Bharat will take it as a no. So thank you so much, Bharat, for being with us. Great session as always, right? And I
Thank
must
you.
say, it's a top-notch knowledge and expertise that you have got in last couple of years. The way you are trying to approach and having that attitude of continuous learning, right? It will go a long way. Thank you very much. And whatever thing that you have mentioned for integration, Bharat, I think it was clearly visible, right? The way you explain the kind of expertise that you have got, and especially it's very the unique topic, and it's very practicality if you look at, right, how the bank integration happens, considering a lot of challenges for encrypted data, whether at rest or maybe at a customer or a bank end, right? So I think thank you
Right.
very much, Bharat.
Yeah. Correctly, Rakesh. It's a very common requirement from the customers, and I thought that that will be good input for community. So that's the reason that I chose this particular topic to share my learnings and experience
Okay,
to everyone.
thank
So
you.
yeah, thank you